end the suffocating darkness between sleep and waking, when the veil grows thin and nightmares bleed into reality. There exists a truth so monstrous that fiction dares not speak its name. Listen closely, for this is not a tale spun from imagination's web, but a confession carved from bone and shadow, a whispered testimony to the horror that walked among us, wearing the mask of a neighbor, a friend, a man who made children laugh while their screams echoed in his basement. The year was 1978, and in the sprawling suburbs of Chicago, where white picket fences promised safety and manicured lawns whispered of American dreams, something ancient and hungry had taken residence. It wore the face of John Wayne Gacy, a man whose smile could light up a room and whose hands could strangle the life from innocence itself. But before we speak his name into the void, before we dare to illuminate the depths of his depravity, we must first understand the silence that preceded the screaming, the terrible, beautiful silence of a predator perfecting his craft. Picture, if you will, a neighborhood where mothers hung laundry on Monday mornings and fathers mowed their lawns on Saturday afternoons, where children rode bicycles down tree-lined streets and the most frightening thing in their world was the possibility of scraped knees or homework left undone. This was the world where boys like Robert Pius lived. 16 years old, bright-eyed, working part-time at a pharmacy to save money for college. Robert had dreams, you see. Dreams of becoming a successful businessman, of making his parents proud, of growing old enough to understand that the world held wonders beyond his imagination. On December 11th, 1978, as snow began to dust the streets of Des Plaines, Robert kissed his mother goodbye and drove to work for what would be his final shift. The pharmacy was warm that evening, fluorescent lights humming their eternal lullaby while Robert stocked shelves and counted inventory. The mundane rhythm of retail work, scan, stack, repeat, created a hypnotic normalcy that would soon be shattered by the arrival of a customer who had been watching, waiting, planning. Enter John Wayne Gacy, community pillar and Democratic precinct captain, a man who entertained children at birthday parties dressed as Pogo the Clown. His makeup was always perfect, white face paint smooth as porcelain, red lips curved in an eternal smile, blue starbursts around his eyes that seemed to twinkle with mirth. Children adored him. Parents trusted him. Neighbors invited him to backyard barbecues where he would regale them with stories of his construction business, his work with the Democratic Party, his charitable endeavors. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that beneath the foundation of his ranch-style home at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue lay a charnel house that would redefine the very concept of evil. But let us return to that December evening, to the moment when predator and prey crossed paths for the final time. Robert was young, eager to please, when Gacy approached him about potential construction work. The offer was simple: good money for weekend labor, cash in hand, no questions asked. For a teenager saving for college, it seemed like Providence itself had walked through the pharmacy door. "I'll need to discuss it with my parents," Robert said, his voice carrying the careful politeness that good children are taught. "But I'm definitely interested." Gacy's smile widened, revealing teeth that gleamed like tombstones in the harsh retail lighting. "Of course, son. Family comes first. Tell you what, why don't you stop by my place after work? We can discuss the details properly." Those words, "stop by my place," would echo through courtrooms and newspaper headlines, through the nightmares of parents and the fevered imagination of Hollywood screenwriters decades later. They would inspire a character known as the Grabber, a monster who lured children with promises of safety before revealing his true nature through a black telephone that connected the living to the dead. But this was no fiction. This was December 11th, 1978, and Robert Piest was about to discover that monsters don't just hide under beds. They build houses above their victims. As Robert's shift ended, he gathered his coat and keys, his mind already calculating how much money he might earn working construction on weekends. He called his mother from the pharmacy, his voice bright with excitement. "Mom, I might have found some extra work. A contractor came by, says he needs help with some projects. I'm just going to go talk to him real quick. Then I'll be home for dinner. Don't be late," his mother replied, not knowing that those would be among the last words her son would ever hear from someone who loved him. "Your cake is cooling on the counter." The cake, sweet 16, though his birthday had passed months before. Elizabeth Piest had baked it as a surprise, chocolate with vanilla frosting, his favorite. It would sit untouched on that counter for days, growing stale while search parties combed the frozen streets and volunteers distributed missing person flyers with Robert's smiling face. The drive to Gacy's house took less than 20 minutes, through neighborhoods that grew progressively quieter as streetlights flickered on in the gathering dusk. Robert followed the contractor's blue Oldsmobile down residential streets, past houses where families were settling in for evening meals, unaware that death was traveling their thoroughfares. 8213 West Somerdale Avenue appeared unremarkable in every way. A single-story ranch house with a two-car garage, brown brick exterior, small front lawn bordered by evergreen shrubs. The kind of house where a man might raise a family, host neighborhood barbecues, live out the American dream in comfortable mediocrity. Inside, however, the house told a different story entirely. The living room was decorated with religious artifacts, crucifixes on the walls, images of saints gazing down with benevolent eyes, a Bible prominently displayed on the coffee table. The irony was not lost on Gacy, who took perverse pleasure in the juxtaposition of sacred symbols above unspeakable acts. He had turned blasphemy into an art form, transforming the holy into the profane with each life he stole. Come in, Gacy beckoned, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a man accustomed to putting others at ease. "Can I get you something to drink? Coffee? Soda?" Robert accepted a Coke, settling onto the couch while Gacy disappeared into the kitchen. In those few moments of solitude, perhaps the teenager sensed something amiss. A subtle wrongness in the air, like the moment before a thunderstorm when animals grow restless and the atmosphere itself seems to hold its breath. When Gacy returned, carrying 2 glasses and wearing that ever-present smile, the transformation had already begun. His eyes, which had seemed jovial in the fluorescent glare of the pharmacy, now appeared flat and predatory in the warm glow of table lamps. His movements had acquired a different quality, more deliberate, more purposeful, like a spider adjusting its web. "So, about that construction work," Gacy began, settling into his chair with the casual ease of a man discussing the weather. "I've got several projects coming up. Good money, like I said. But first, I need to know if you're really serious about this. Some kids, they think they want to work, but when it comes time to get their hands dirty..." He let the words hang in the air, studying Robert's reaction with the intensity of a scientist observing a specimen. This was part of his ritual, the psychological grooming that preceded the physical horror. He needed to see the hunger in their eyes, the desire for money, for respect, for the approval of an adult who seemed to take them seriously. "I'm serious," Robert replied, leaning forward slightly. "I need the money for college. I'll do whatever kind of work you have." "Whatever kind of work I have," Gacy repeated, savoring the words like a fine wine. "That's good to hear, Robert. That's very good to hear. The teenager never noticed when Gacy's hand moved to the rope he kept coiled beneath his chair. Never saw the practiced motion as the killer rose to his feet. Never heard the whisper of hemp against denim as the noose was prepared. By the time Robert understood what was happening, it was far too late. The struggle was brief. Gacy had perfected his technique through years of practice, learned to apply just enough pressure to render his victims unconscious without killing them immediately. He needed them alive for what came next. The games, the torture, the slow erosion of hope that fed his insatiable hunger for control. When Robert awoke, he found himself in a place that existed beyond the boundaries of human comprehension. A basement that had been transformed into a theater of horrors, where 32 other young men had already discovered that death was not the worst thing that could happen to them. The walls were lined with lime, both to control the smell and to accelerate decomposition. Power tools hung from pegboards like surgical instruments in some demonic operating room. In the corner sat a device that Gacy called his rack, a makeshift torture apparatus that he used to extract confessions, pleas, prayers from his victims before he finally allowed them the mercy of death. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the phone. A black rotary telephone sat on a small table in the center of the basement, its receiver gleaming dully in the harsh fluorescent light. Gacy had installed it as part of his psychological torture, allowing his victims to make final calls to their families. Calls that were never completed, words of love and desperation that echoed into the void of a disconnected line. "Go ahead," he would whisper to his prey as they hung suspended from the ceiling, barely conscious from pain and terror. "Call for help. Call your mother. Call God himself. See who answers." The phone never rang. No one ever answered. But the victims called anyway, driven by hope that refused to die even as their bodies began to fail. They called until their voices gave out, until their fingers could no longer work the rotary dial, until Gacy grew bored with their suffering and ended their misery with his bare hands. Robert Piest was different, though. Something about the teenager's defiance, his refusal to beg or plead or break completely, intrigued the killer in ways he had never experienced before. For 6 days, Gacy kept him alive, drawing out the torture with an artist's attention to detail. And during those 6 days, something impossible began to happen. The phone started to ring. At first, Gacy dismissed it as a malfunction, old wiring, cross signals, the urban symphony of electronic interference that plagued city dwellings. But the calls came at specific times, always in the darkest hours of the night, always when Robert's suffering reached its peak intensity. When Gacy finally answered, expecting to hear a dial tone or the voice of some unfortunate soul who had misdialed, he was greeted instead by whispers. Voices he recognized but thought he had silenced forever. The voices of his previous victims, calling from whatever realm awaited those who died in agony and terror. "We see you," they whispered through the static. "We know what you've done, and we're coming for you." Gacy's hands began to shake. His perfect composure, maintained through years of killing, started to crack like paint on a weathered wall. The phone calls came more frequently, and with each ring the voices grew stronger, more insistent, more real. It was during the final call that Gacy learned the truth. A truth so horrific that it would drive him to confess his crimes to police, to guide them to the mass grave beneath his house, to reveal the location of every body he had hidden in his private charnel house. The voice on the phone was not one of his victims. It was his own. In some twisted loop of time and space, some cosmic joke played by forces beyond human understanding, John Wayne Gacy was receiving calls from himself, from a future where justice had finally caught up with him, where he sat in a prison cell awaiting execution, calling back through the years to the moment when he might have chosen differently. "Stop!" The voice pleaded through the black plastic receiver. "Please, for the love of God, just stop. They're going to catch you. They're going to kill you. And you're going to spend eternity in a place where the screaming never ends." But it was too late. The wheel had already been set in motion, the pattern of death and discovery that would make John Wayne Gacy infamous throughout history. On December 21st, 1978, police armed with a search warrant would arrive at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue. They would follow the smell of lime and decay to the basement, where they would uncover a horror that defied comprehension. 33 bodies. 33 young men who had trusted the wrong person, accepted the wrong invitation, answered the wrong offer of employment. Their names would become a litany of loss. Robert Piest, John Butkovich, Darrell Sampson, Randall Reffitt, Samuel Stapleton, Michael Bonin, William Carroll, Gregory Godzik, John Ezyc, John Prestige, Matthew Bowman, Robert Gilroy, John Mowry, Russell Nelson, Robert Winch, Tommy Bowling, David Talsma, William Kindred, Timothy O'Rourke, Frank Landingen, James Matsara, Robert Piest, and 20 others whose names have been carved into the collective memory of a nation that learned to lock its doors and question the smiles of strangers. The investigation would reveal that Gacy had been perfecting his craft for nearly a decade, using his construction business as a cover for his hunting expeditions. He would target young men on the margins of society, runaways, drifters, those whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed or thoroughly investigated. But Robert Piest was different. Robert had a family who loved him, parents who would not rest until they found their son. His disappearance triggered a manhunt that ultimately led police to Gacy's door, where the smell of death could no longer be hidden by lime and earth. During his trial, Gacy would claim insanity, arguing that he was driven by forces beyond his control. His lawyers would paint a picture of a man haunted by childhood trauma, broken by abuse, transformed into a monster against his will. But those who studied the evidence knew better. This was not madness. This was evil in its purest form, calculated and deliberate, fed by an appetite that could never be satisfied. The black phone, when police finally found it in Gacy's basement, had been disconnected for months. The telephone company had no record of any calls being made to or from that number during the period of Robert Piest's captivity. Yet the phone's receiver bore the fingerprints of every victim, as if each had tried desperately to make one final connection to the world of the living. Years later, when Hollywood began to mine Gacy's crimes for inspiration, they would create a character called the Grabber, a masked killer who used children's innocence against them, who made them complicit in their own destruction through a supernatural phone that connected the dead to the living. The movie would be called The Black Phone, and it would terrify audiences who had no idea they were watching a sanitized version of true events that were far more horrific than any fiction. But the real horror was not in the basement of 8213 West Somerdale Avenue. The real horror was that for nearly a decade, John Wayne Gacy walked among us as a pillar of the community. He shook hands with politicians, entertained children at hospitals, volunteered for charitable causes, and attended church every Sunday. He was the neighbor who would help you move furniture, the friend who would lend you his truck, the community leader who made speeches about the importance of civic responsibility. And every night, he would return to his house of horrors, where the phone continued to ring with calls that could never be answered, from voices that should have been silenced forever, carrying messages of warning that arrived too late to save anyone. The last call came on the night before Gacy's arrest. Police were already closing in, following the trail of evidence that led inexorably to his door. As he sat in his living room, surrounded by religious artifacts that had witnessed unspeakable blasphemies, the black phone rang one final time. This time, when he answered, the voice was different. Clear, calm, unmistakably real. "John," the voice said, and he recognized it immediately as belonging to Robert Piest. "We've been waiting for you." Gacy dropped the receiver, but the voice continued to emanate from the phone, growing louder with each word. "We've all been waiting, and now it's time for you to join us." The line went dead just as police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer with each passing second. Gacy looked around his living room one last time, at the crucifixes on the walls, the Bible on the coffee table, the framed photographs of him dressed as Pogo the Clown, bringing joy to children who would never know how close they had come to monsters. He walked to the basement door and descended the stairs one final time, past the lime-covered walls and the makeshift torture devices, to where the black phone sat on its small table. The receiver was off the hook, and from it came a sound that would haunt investigators for years afterward. The sound of 33 voices, all talking at once, all calling his name. When police found him 20 minutes later, John Wayne Gacy was sitting in his chair, staring at the phone with an expression of absolute terror frozen on his face. His hair had turned completely white, and his eyes held the glazed look of a man who had finally seen the true face of hell. He confessed to everything that night, leading investigators to every body, every hiding place, every secret he had kept buried beneath his house of horrors. But he never spoke of the phone calls, never mentioned the voices that had tormented him in his final days of freedom. The black phone was entered into evidence as item number 127B, tagged and stored in a police warehouse where it sits to this day. According to official reports, it has been disconnected for over 40 years. But sometimes, late at night, when the building is empty and the fluorescent lights hum their eternal lullaby, security guards report hearing it ring. They never answer. They know better than to pick up a phone that connects the living to the dead, a device that bridges the gap between justice and vengeance, between the world we inhabit and the realm where 33 young men wait patiently for their killer to join them in whatever darkness lies beyond the grave. And somewhere, in a parallel universe where Hollywood screenwriters mine the depths of human evil for entertainment, a movie called The Black Phone tells a sanitized version of the story. A tale where children escape their captors, where good triumphs over evil, where the phone calls from beyond actually save lives instead of tormenting the guilty. But here, in the real world where monsters wear human faces and evil hides behind smiles and community service awards, the truth is far more terrifying than any fiction. John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection on May 10, 1994. His last words were reportedly, "Kiss my ass." But those who worked the death row that night tell a different story. They say that just before the needle entered his arm, Gacy's eyes went wide with terror, and he whispered something that chilled the blood of everyone present. "The phone," he said. "They're calling me home." The phone booth outside the prison started ringing at exactly 12:58 a.m., 2 minutes before Gacy was pronounced dead. It rang for exactly 33 minutes, 1 minute for each of his victims. No one answered that call either. But sometimes, in the suffocating darkness between sleep and waking, when the veil grows thin and nightmares bleed into reality, you might hear your own phone ringing in the dead of night and wonder if the voices of the past are finally ready to collect on debts that can never be repaid.